Good morning, gamers. I wonder if I can call you gamers. You notice Kirby plays World Game. I have this sort of literary approach to World Game. I understand it was a trademarked specific organization and a specific institution, but then there is the game of the world, the great game, whatever you want to call it, just playing the game of world. And people say, well, it's not really just play, and that's to trivialize it, and that's against YouTube guidelines to trivialize something serious. So I have to make sure I'm appropriately serious about this game. But I feel people are. They use the word game for like really serious stuff, right? Like game theory is about world affairs. The word game, I think, you can highlight how it trivializes, but that's really just to put your finger on the scale and tip it some way, but you can tip it the other way. It's a serious game, and it's got a lot of history. We've been playing World Game for a couple thousand more years. Like, I'm just making up a starting point. Really, January 1st, 1970 is when the epoch began. That's the Unix epoch, so that's kind of the geek world I inhabit. So today's Memorial Day, and I'd like to say I appreciated how the humanists of Greater Portland introduced Gus Frederick's talk with a little bit of history about when Memorial Day came to be in the federal calendar. And it was about the Civil War at first, because there were lots of war dead, right? And that needed to be honored and remembered. As I talk, I'm scrolling through a write up of Gus Frederick's talk just yesterday to the humanists about one of his favorite subjects, the cartoonist Homer Davenport, who also had an interest in Arabian horses and actually went and visited with this sheik that I'm showing on the screen at some point to get some more Arabian horses. He got some of them from the Chicago World's Fair in the late 1800s. That was the one where electricity made its great debut. Showed people the future. It was going to be General Electric and all those. Westinghouse, right? Westinghouse teamed up with Tesla and the AC crowd and kind of beat out Edison's DC crowd, as I recall. Looking at some pictures from the slideshow, I took some screenshots. I connected by Zoom. Just wanted to point out a couple things. Gus says that one of the things Thomas Nast, the great cartoonist prior to Davenport, should be remembered for is his depiction of Santa Claus, shown here as one of the iconic figures in American mythology. However, I would like to go forward with that story in terms of the Coca-Cola adoption of this guy and the fueling and funding of Santa Claus as a Coca-Cola project. That would be something. Start here and go forward with that story. What I'm looking for are threads or stories that go backwards and forwards, so that when I say, for example, in recent video that I think Bucky Fuller, his life, should be used as a way of indexing into a whole lot of other timelines and tying them all together, because he lived so long, because he knew so many. That wouldn't work as just the single access strategy, right? That's in complement with other partially overlapping scenarios, including, I would say, a lot of what I will call fringe characters, people that are fun to study because they're so anomalous in some ways, and projects that they undertook. I'm thinking of Father Divine in particular. Like, I did some college work around Malcolm X. I can't say I was graded too highly on what I did. They said it was just kind of rehash of Freudian stuff, but what can you do? It's kind of a lot of work keeping up with the Princeton curriculum. I even failed to turn in a whole paper on Wittgenstein to Dr. Preller. I think he failed me in that particular course as a result. I just disorganized, right, about the calendar. But anyway, I would bring in this whole Rajneeshpuram thing that happened in Oregon and link it to, in general, the convergence of Eastern and Western religions in the American psyche, going back to before the 1960s, but including, the influence of Ravi Shankar and on the Beatles and stuff like that, but lots more than that. But going back to the Theosophists, especially, and then, go forward through this Rajneeshpuram experiment in Wasco County. This documentary, Wild Wild Country, I finally got around to watching, thanks to Beth and others, and it's really well made. It's really well done, and 6 episodes. Saw it on Netflix. So I would combine threads like that, and how would I tie Rajneeshpuram specifically to Bucky Fuller? Well, I probably wouldn't go too directly, other than the idea of a prototype community, experimental community. That would be a connection going forward. In other words, we'd like to do more campuses, but have them be successful, have better town-gown relations than in that movie, for example. Maybe something near Yellowknife at some point. I just always think about experimental prototype communities, and I'm very aware of refugee issues and wanting to adapt the Project Renaissance approach to the problem of refugees everywhere needing accommodations, not just thinking about refugees coming across the U.S. but southern border as it is. That was, the spread of the U.S. was very fast. The Monroe Doctrine was implemented kind of hastily, not long after the Louisiana Purchase, looking back. I mean, Lewis and Clark seems like just yesterday in historical terms. So, in terms of growing pains, I think if the U.S. were interested in national integrity and just being a nation, it would focus a lot more on consolidation and much less on adventures overseas. I take this whole war in Ukraine as very strong evidence that the U.S. has lost control of itself because it's investing all its fortune in a foreign adventure in Europe, which proves that a huge piece of like its psychic energy apparently it did not get free of the East, Eurasia, and so on. It's still at the beck and call of like the British psyche, because the British tend to be nuts about the Russians, and that has infected Washington, D.C. And I feel like that's very much evidence that we don't really have a USA anymore because of what's been allowed to happen, how there are no breaks, and what to do about that. Well, that's where the Bucky Fuller stuff comes in, and that's where we still have the ability to sort of recreate from scratch some institutions based on that we have a brighter vision of the future. We can compete with the old vision, the so-called law cap vision. You know what I'm talking about if you've been on this channel for a while. General systems theory. This Project Renaissance, I'm sure, would be criticized and demonized if it were to ever see the light of day to any degree, because people don't trust the whole idea of public-private partnerships much anymore, or at least I've heard a lot of rhetoric against it. It's got NATO in it. It's got all this, right? This was me in the 1970s. And when I sent this to Applewhite, he thought it made a lot of sense, is what he said. And he was also very sympathetic to my Mark Twain sensibilities. Mark Twain being in the anti-imperialist league. Like, I don't think the Manifest Destiny crowd and those people who were pro taking over the Philippines from Spain. Philippine-American War is one of the saddest chapters ever in the American saga, and I think the bankruptcy of this whole idea of being the last only superpower, if you suckered for that, then you're kind of like part of the problem, right? So I'm no big fan of world domination by the United States. But on the other hand, I do enjoy playing with the world domination meme. It was just a free and open source engineering approach, design science revolution, as I call it, that has captured the imagination of the world way more than anything that DC can take credit for. I don't give credit to that city state for all the great prosperity that was Silicon Valley, but I'm Silicon Forest, right? I'm not Google. Like, I would redraw the maps already. I think the strategy in the case of the Donbass is I see those as getting ready for redevelopment. Those new provinces that the Russians did all the legal maneuvering because they're really a legalistic culture like the U.S. And I do recognize Crimea and the Donbass are no longer Ukraine. They blew it. They could have done a better job to consolidate Ukraine, but they went the military route, and that was dumbass. Dumbass in the Donbass. So here's more Homer Davenport cartoons. I don't know if we have any cartoonists living today with this kind of talent. I kind of don't think so. They're not edgy. South Park's pretty good. But we've kind of lost our way in terms of a culture. We would do well to study history just in order to glue it back together a little bit. Humpty Dumpty. I know you can't completely put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but I think you could make a good start with more study of future and past. Get to the future with a stronger understanding of the past. So I still believe in education, but not necessarily corporate textbooks. If you're participating in the tree killing economy and buying big, thick, heavy textbooks because you like the feel of big, heavy textbooks, I think you should go paperless myself. And don't coddle yourself in that way. Watch YouTubes, read screens, and don't insist that all schools across the country agree on some vapid, tepid, watered down, gross travesty of a history book like you would get in high school. We really need to do high school over and make it more intelligent and more adult. Okay, that's my rant for today. Happy Memorial Day. We'll talk to you soon.